Julian accepted Margaret's settlement before the 7 days expired. The reservoir, mills, and mineral rights were transferred into a trust controlled by Margaret and elected tenant representatives. Every family received a permanent lease, and no mining could begin without their approval and compensation. Wycliffe was convicted of conspiracy, fraud, arson, and endangering the villages. Crane received a reduced sentence for testifying. Julian's punishment was different. He withdrew from Parliament, sold 2 estates to pay the reservoir debt, and published a signed confession in every county newspaper that had repeated his accusation against Margaret. Ravensmere Hall remained his. Most of the power surrounding it did not. Months later, the restored reservoir reopened. The broken southern channel had been rebuilt. The mills were turning again, and water flowed toward all 6 villages. Margaret stood above the main gate with a new silver key at her waist. Julian attended alone, separated from the tenants who had once removed their caps when he passed. After the ceremony, he approached her. "I cannot undo what I chose. No. I have paid everything the settlement required. Restitution is not forgiveness," Margaret said. "It is merely what justice costs." He did not ask her to return. Their legal separation was completed that spring. Margaret established her home near Harrington Engineering and continued designing waterworks across the county under her own name. Before leaving the reservoir, she turned the new silver key. The gates opened, sending the first clear current into the village channels. 11 years earlier, Julian had promised that Ravensmere would remember her. Now it did. Not as the Duke's obedient wife, but as the woman who reclaimed everything his ambition had placed in danger. The Crown inquiry filled the Ravensmere Assembly Hall. Margaret presented the evidence without exaggeration. The complete maintenance accounts, Wycliffe's delivery ledger, the signed development agreement, and statements from Reed, Crane, and the tenants who witnessed the spillway sabotage. The missing receipts proved Margaret had stolen nothing. Wycliffe had removed them to justify replacing her with men he controlled. Crane confessed that the fire was intended to make the southern villages appear uninhabitable. Once the families left, Wycliffe would claim the coal without negotiating their leases. Wycliffe denied everything until the magistrate showed him his own payment ledger. He was charged with conspiracy, arson, fraud, and attempting to endanger the villages. Then Julian was called. He could have blamed Wycliffe entirely. Instead, he faced the same 200 tenants he had summoned to witness Margaret's humiliation. "My wife warned me that the reservoir could not safely be drained," he said. "She asked for an independent audit. I refused." He looked toward Margaret. "I knew there was no proof that she had stolen money. I used the accusation because her disgrace was more convenient than losing Wycliffe's political support." Silence settled across the hall. "I did not order the fire," Julian continued, "but I signed the agreement that threatened your homes. When I learned what Wycliffe had placed in the fields, I allowed the hunt to proceed. The responsibility for those choices is mine." The Crown officials cleared Margaret of every allegation and ordered Julian to publish a formal correction. His parliamentary supporters withdrew before the inquiry ended. Then Sir Thomas's solicitor presented the unpaid reservoir agreement. By falsely accusing Margaret and removing her from management, Julian had violated her marriage settlement and become liable for the damaged waterworks, unpaid equipment, lost mill revenue, and tenant compensation. The total exceeded the money Ravensmere could immediately raise. Margaret placed the settlement demand before him. Julian stared at the document. "What do you intend to take?" "The reservoir, the mills, and the mineral rights beneath the villages. That would remove half the estate's power. You surrendered that power when you used it against the people who depended upon you." The Crown officials gave Julian 7 days to accept the settlement or face foreclosure proceedings against a larger portion of Ravensmere. He had regained the truth too late. Now Margaret would decide what justice cost. The fire left the southern valley blackened but standing. No tenant had died. Only 2 cottages suffered roof damage, and the families had already been moved to safety. The reservoir's bypass channel, however, lay broken beneath mud and stone. Margaret stood beside the ruined masonry as Reed examined the spillway. "This was deliberate," he said. "The wooden peg would have failed as soon as the gate took pressure." Thomas Bell brought forward 2 tenants who had watched the gatehouse. Both had seen Crane strike the peg after Wycliffe gave the signal. The county constable recorded their statements. Crane refused to speak until Margaret placed the delivery account before him. "It carries your signature," she said. "So do the orders for the oil and powder. Wycliffe has fled, leaving you to answer for everything." Crane looked toward Julian, perhaps expecting protection. Julian gave him none. "He promised the fire would remain within the hunting fields," Crane finally said. "Afterward, The villages would be declared unsafe. The tenants would leave, and the mining leases could proceed without resistance. And the spillway? Reed asked. It was meant to destroy the lower road and finish what the fire began. Crane surrendered a ledger listing payments to the laborers, guards, and carriers involved. He also revealed that Wycliffe was traveling north with the original mining contract and the missing reservoir receipts. Julian ordered riders after him. Margaret stopped him. Your men obeyed Wycliffe yesterday. The county constable will make the arrest. The words struck harder than an accusation. Julian had lost the right to command trust upon his own estate. Wycliffe was captured before midnight at a railway station 12 miles away. The documents in his case connected him to the false accounts, the planned evictions, and the fire. But one paper bore only Julian's signature. It granted Wycliffe authority to clear any land considered necessary for mineral development. Julian read it beneath the constable's lamp. I did not authorize murder. No, Margaret said. You merely gave him the land, removed the woman who questioned him, and silenced the families standing in his way. I believed the tenants would be compensated. You never asked what they would lose. Across the valley, the Harrington pump continued supplying water to Millbank. The mills remained silent, the mine remained closed, and Julian's political guests were already leaving Ravensmere. One newspaper editor paused beside Margaret's carriage. Will there be a public inquiry? There will be, she answered. And it will begin where my husband chose to accuse me, before the people whose homes he risked. Julian looked at her. For the first time, he did not ask her to protect his title or soften the truth. Will you testify against me? Margaret placed the signed development agreement inside her solicitor's case. I will testify to exactly what you chose. 3 days later, Crown officials arrived at Ravensmere. The assembly hall was prepared for the inquiry, and 200 tenants came to hear whether their duke would finally tell the truth, without his wife being forced to drag it from him. Christmas morning arrived beneath a pale sky. More than 80 guests gathered before Ravensmere Hall. Politicians, newspaper editors, and wealthy landowners filled the courtyard, while servants poured wine beside a fountain that no longer held water. Julian mounted beneath the ducal banner, dressed as though the silent mills and empty cisterns did not exist. Wycliffe raised a glass. To Ravensmere's future. The hunt entered the southern fields shortly after 10. Scarlet-coated riders passed between canvas screens, while beaters drove pheasants from piles of dry straw. Margaret watched from the Millbank orchard with Reed and the tenant fire crews. The steam pump stood ready beside the eastern stream. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then Reed pointed toward the western screen. Silas Crane crouched behind it with a lantern. A line of fire raced along the turpentine-soaked canvas. Flames reached the straw and spread across the dry reeds surrounding the drained reservoir. Wycliffe's men shouted that a guest had dropped a match, but the fire had started in 3 places at once. Wind drove it toward Millbank. Horses reared as smoke swallowed the hunting route. Guests scattered across the field, colliding with servants carrying buckets from wells already too low to use. Julian shouted for the estate firefighting carts. They arrived almost empty. Only then did he see what Margaret had warned him about. Dry cisterns, broken water lines, and hundreds of people trapped between the flames and a reservoir he had ordered drained. The Harrington steam pump thundered to life. Margaret rode beside the first hose. Hold the orchard firebreak, she ordered. Protect the cottages before the fields. Her engineers directed water across the flames, while the tenants used soaked blankets and shovels to contain the burning reeds. Sir Thomas's wagons formed a barrier along the village road. Julian rode toward her through the smoke. You prepared for this. I warned you about this. Help me protect the guests. Your guests have horses and an open northern road. The villagers have homes they cannot carry away. He looked toward the politicians fleeing beneath his banner. The spectacle meant to prove his leadership had revealed his complete dependence upon the wife he had disgraced. A horn sounded from the southern gatehouse. Reed turned sharply. That is not a hunting signal. Through the smoke, they saw Wycliffe's guards removing the chain from the emergency spillway. The missing locking pin had already been replaced with a weaker wooden peg. If the gate opened, the remaining reservoir water would tear through the firebreak and carry burning straw into Millbank. Margaret divided her crew. Keep the pump here. Reed, Bell, with me. Julian caught her horse's bridle. The gatehouse is under my authority. Margaret looked down at his hand. Then use it. Together they rode toward the spillway. Wycliffe stood above the gate, shouting that the water must be released to extinguish the fire. He is directing it toward the village, Margaret said. Julian saw the open channel below and finally understood. Close the gate, he ordered. Wycliffe ignored him. Crane struck the wooden peg with a hammer. It split. The spillway gate began to rise, and the remaining water surged toward the burning fields. Margaret pulled the bypass lever, but the mechanism resisted. Wycliffe's men had jammed it with an iron bar. Julian drew his pistol and fired into the bar's retaining chain. The chain broke. Margaret and Reed forced the bypass wheel around. Water changed direction, rushing away from Millbank and into the old marsh. The sudden current swept the burning screens from the field, but destroyed part of the reservoir's southern channel. Margaret watched 11 years of her work collapse into the mud. She did not release the wheel. Stone could be rebuilt. 200 families could not. Behind them, county constables seized Crane. Wycliffe had already fled. By sunset, the fire was contained, and every village remained standing. Across the blackened valley, Julian's political guests watched Margaret command the workers he had dismissed, using the machinery he had tried to seize, to save the tenants he had been willing to remove. His Christmas hunt had ended. So had the future Wycliffe had promised him. Before midnight, the Harrington engineers mounted the portable steam pump on a reinforced wagon and moved it toward the eastern stream. Julian had posted estate constables across the main roads, but Margaret used the access route guaranteed by the original Reservoir agreement. The contract allowed Harrington Engineering to reach any channel connected to its machinery until the construction debt was paid. The constable blocking the bridge examined the certified copy. His Grace ordered that you remain outside Ravensmere. His Grace also signed this agreement, Margaret replied. He cannot keep its benefits while refusing its obligations. The man stepped aside. By dawn, the pump stood concealed behind the Millbank orchard. 2 hoses stretched beneath straw coverings toward the southern fields. Tenant men cleared dead grass around the cottages, while women and children traveled in Harrington wagons to her father's land. Margaret did not call it an evacuation. That would have allowed Wycliffe to claim the cottages were abandoned. Each family left a male representative behind, with witnesses recording that the removal was temporary and made solely for safety. As the final wagon departed, Thomas Bell approached Margaret. His Grace's steward says anyone helping you may lose his lease. Ask the steward to issue that threat in writing. He refused. Then he knows it is unlawful. Bell looked toward Ravensmere Hall, where fireworks were being unloaded for the Christmas celebration. Did the Duke truly know what Wycliffe intended? He knew the land might be cleared. He knew the fire supplies had been placed beside your homes. I cannot tell you what he believes Wycliffe will do. But he chose not to stop him. Yes. The answer cost Margaret more than she allowed her face to show. At noon, Julian arrived with 6 mounted constables. He found the fire breaks completed and the portable pump drawing test water from the stream. I ordered you off my land. Margaret handed him the reservoir agreement. The eastern channel remains under Harrington maintenance. You are using a technical clause to defy me. I am using your signature to protect the people your next signature placed in danger. Julian looked at the tenants gathered behind her. Remove the pump before the hunt begins. No? His expression hardened. Then I will have it seized. Sir Thomas stepped from behind the engine with 2 solicitors. The pump belongs to my company, he said. Touch it, and I will seek an injunction against every mineral operation bearing the Ravensmere name. Julian lowered his voice. You are humiliating me before my tenants. Margaret met his gaze. You did that yourself when you made them watch you break the system keeping them alive. For a moment, he seemed close to canceling the hunt. Then horns sounded from the hall, announcing the arrival of Wycliffe's most influential guests. Julian looked toward the ducal banners flying above the roof. The hunt proceeds, he said. Then every consequence proceeds with it. He rode away. That evening, Reed returned from the southern fields carrying a small iron fitting. It had been removed from the emergency spillway. Without this locking pin, Wycliffe's men can release the remaining water whenever they choose, he said. Margaret studied the map. The sudden flow would cross the fire break and scatter burning debris directly toward Millbank. Can we replace it? Not without entering the gatehouse. Wycliffe has guards there. Margaret did not order an attack. Instead, she stationed Reed near the bypass channel and placed witnesses where they could observe the gatehouse. If Wycliffe opened the spillway, they would divert the water into the old marsh. If he lit the fields, the pump would protect the village. And if Julian tried to deny that he had been warned, 200 tenants would be ready to answer him. Beyond the hills, Christmas bells began to ring. In the southern fields, Wycliffe's oil-soaked hunting screens waited for a flame. By the following morning, the consequences of Julian's decision had spread across Ravensmere. The grain mills stood silent because the Harrington pressure valves had been removed. Water seeped steadily into the lower level of the coal mine, forcing the manager to suspend work and send 80 men home. At the castle, servants carried barrels from an old eastern well because the upper cisterns no longer refilled automatically. The Christmas guests had begun to arrive despite everything. Carriages rolled beneath the ducal gates carrying politicians, landowners, and newspaper editors whom Wycliffe believed could secure Julian's parliamentary nomination. They found hunting pavilions rising across a drained reservoir while exhausted laborers hauled water past them. Julian summoned Margaret to the library shortly before noon. Wycliffe stood beside the fire. Lady Cecily occupied the chair where Margaret had once reviewed the estate accounts with her husband. Julian placed the delivery record Reed had taken from Crane upon the desk. You showed this to the tenants. I showed it to their appointed representatives. You had no authority to alarm them. They have authority over whether their families remain in cottages marked for removal. Wycliffe gave a contemptuous laugh. No eviction orders have been issued, because the Crown Surveyor has not yet confirmed the coal. Once he does, you will declare the southern villages necessary for development. Julian's expression revealed no surprise. Margaret had come hoping that his silence at the gatehouse had been uncertainty. Now she understood it had been calculation. You knew, she said. I knew some leases might require negotiation. 200 families are not a technical clause in a mining agreement. They will be compensated, Julian replied. New cottages can be built elsewhere, on poorer land, without access to their mills, orchards, or grazing rights. Wycliffe moved closer to the desk. Ravensmere possesses coal worth more than every cottage in that valley combined. Sentiment cannot be allowed to obstruct prosperity. Margaret ignored him. Did you know Crane placed blasting powder beneath the retaining wall? Julian hesitated. Wycliffe assures me it is intended for geological testing. Then suspend the work until an independent engineer examines it. The Crown Surveyor arrives after Christmas. The hunt must also be suspended. Julian's face hardened. That is what you truly want. You have crippled my mills, frightened my tenants, and embarrassed me before my guests. Now you expect me to cancel the gathering that could secure Ravensmere's political future. I expect you to prevent a fire. She placed the delivery account between them and pointed to the quantities. Dry straw, lamp oil, canvas hunting screens, mining powder, all delivered to the same 3 fields. Your fire cisterns are nearly empty, and Wycliffe's men control the only remaining reservoir gates. Lady Cecily rose. The straw is for the horses. The oil is for the pavilions. Then there should be no objection to moving both away from the villages. There is no danger, Wycliffe said. Margaret looked again at Julian. Order him to move them. Julian could have done it with a sentence. Instead, he folded the delivery account. The hunt proceeds as planned. No equipment will be moved unless Wycliffe's surveyor considers it necessary. Margaret felt the final uncertainty leave her. Julian was no longer merely deceived. He had been shown the risk and had chosen to protect the spectacle. If those fields burn, she said, every person in this room will know you were warned. You are forbidden from entering Ravensmere land until the hunt is finished. You cannot exclude Harrington Engineering from the waterworks while our ownership claim remains unsettled. I can exclude my wife from my house and private fields. Margaret removed her wedding ring. For 12 years, she had worn it through flood inspections, harvest failures, and nights spent beside injured laborers. She placed it upon the delivery account. Then your wife will not return, she said. The engineer will. She left before Julian could answer. That afternoon, representatives from all 6 villages gathered at Harrington House. Margaret placed copies of the reservoir accounts, the mining agreement, and the delivery record before them. Thomas Bell read the clause allowing Wycliffe to clear land required for development. The Duke signed this willingly? 6 weeks ago! And he still says no decision has been made? He means no decision has been announced. Anger moved through the room, but Margaret refused to let it become disorder. If you confront Julian tonight, Wycliffe will call it a rebellion. He will use it to bring soldiers or magistrates onto the estate. What do you propose? Bell asked. The women, children, and elderly leave the southern cottages before Christmas morning. My father will house them. The remaining tenants will clear strips of dead grass around the villages and move every hay cart behind stone walls. Reed unfolded a map. We can place the portable steam pump beside the eastern stream. It will supply 2 hoses without depending upon the reservoir. Sir Thomas studied his daughter. Julian may send constables to stop us. The original construction agreement guarantees Harrington Engineers access to every channel connected to our machinery until the debt is paid. A faint smile touched her father's face. He should have read the contracts before insulting the woman who wrote them. Margaret assigned each village a water wagon, fire crew, and evacuation route. She did not promise that Wycliffe would strike. She prepared them because Julian had refused to prevent him. Near dusk, Reed returned from inspecting the public road beside the hunting fields. He carried a length of canvas cut from one of Wycliffe's screens. A dark substance stained its lower edge. Margaret touched it with one gloved finger and smelled turpentine. The screens had not merely been placed near the oil. They had already been soaked in it. Outside, the bells of Ravensmere Hall began welcoming Julian's political guests to the estate. Margaret turned toward the waiting engineers. "Move the pump tonight," she ordered, "before my husband's ambition gives Wycliffe the match." Margaret did not allow the injured assistant's fear to determine her next move. "Did you see Mr. Reed taken into the tunnel?" she asked. The young man shook his head, struggling to breathe evenly. "No, Your Grace. Wycliffe's men struck me when I tried to follow. They dragged Mr. Reed toward the southern wall. Then we do not yet know that he is inside it." Sir Thomas understood her caution. A threat delivered without a witness might be intended to draw Margaret into the tunnels, where Wycliffe could accuse her of trespassing, damaging the embankment, or planting the blasting powder herself. Margaret sent 2 riders along opposite roads to summon the county constable. Then she ordered the Harrington crews to continue removing their machinery. "If Wycliffe expects me to abandon everything and run to the reservoir," she said, "he must not know that we have recognized the trap." She approached the southern wall with her father, 3 engineers, and a solicitor carrying the ownership agreements. They did not enter through the maintenance tunnels. Instead, Margaret led them along the public mill road, where tenant families could witness what happened. They found Reed beneath the gatehouse awning, his hands bound and 2 estate guards standing beside him. Silas Crane held the geological map they had taken from Wycliffe's office. Crane smiled when he saw Margaret. "Your engineer was discovered interfering with the Duke's property." "The southern wall remains partly the property of Harrington Engineering," Margaret replied. "Release him. His Grace suspended your authority. He did not acquire my father's equipment by suspending me." Crane pointed toward several wooden crates stacked near the exposed embankment. Their markings identified them as mining supplies. Margaret did not need to open them to know what they contained. "Blasting powder. The materials are intended for geological testing," Crane said. Mr. Reed attempted to remove them. Reed raised his head. Blood darkened one side of his collar. "They drilled beneath the retaining wall," he said, "not the coal seam." One of the guards struck him across the shoulder. Sir Thomas stepped forward, but Margaret stopped him. Nearly 40 tenants had now gathered along the road. More were approaching from Millbank. Margaret faced the guards. "You are men of Ravensmere. You know what lies below this wall. If it fails, the water will not reach Lord Wycliffe's house. It will reach yours." Neither man answered. Crane produced a folded order bearing Julian's signature. It granted Wycliffe's agents authority to conduct mineral surveys anywhere within the reservoir boundary. Margaret read it carefully. The order was genuine. Julian had not merely accepted Wycliffe's plan for a hunting ground. He had knowingly granted him access to the land beneath the reservoir. "When did the Duke sign this?" she asked. 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. Long before Julian questioned the maintenance accounts. Long before he pretended that draining the basin was merely part of a Christmas spectacle. The accusation against Margaret had never begun with missing receipts. It had been created after Julian had already committed Ravensmere to Wycliffe's development scheme. Hooves sounded along the mill road. Julian arrived with Lady Cecily and 4 estate constables. His expression hardened when he saw the tenants surrounding the gatehouse. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Your men assaulted my engineers," Margaret said. "They are storing blasting powder beneath a water-retaining wall." Julian looked toward Crane. "Materials for the mineral survey," Crane answered smoothly. Margaret handed Julian the order carrying his signature. "You gave Wycliffe authority to drill here 6 weeks ago. Did you also give him authority to clear the tenant holdings above the coal?" A murmur passed through the crowd. Julian glanced at the gathering families before lowering his voice. "This is not the place. It became the place when you accused me before these same people. There will be compensation for any land required." The tenants fell silent. Margaret studied her husband's face. He was not surprised by the possibility of eviction. He had known. "How many families?" she asked. "Nothing has been decided. You signed a development agreement before inspecting the water levels. You allowed Wycliffe's clerk to take the accounts. Then you called me a thief because I stood between him and the valley." Julian's gaze shifted toward the watching tenants. For one moment, shame appeared in his expression. Then ambition smothered it. "Ravensmere cannot remain unchanged forever," he said. "The coal may secure this estate for generations. If several leases must be reconsidered, that is a matter for lawful negotiation." 200 leases? His silence answered her. Thomas Bell, The millbank miller stepped out of the crowd. "My family has held our farm for 80 years, and no one has ordered you to leave," Julian replied. "Not yet," Margaret said. She turned to the estate guards. "You may continue holding Mr. Reed if you are prepared to testify that you assaulted him while protecting explosives placed beneath your own villages." The older guard looked at Reed's bloodied face. Then he cut the ropes. Crane protested, but the men stepped away from him. Margaret did not seize the powder or enter the tunnel. Instead, she ordered her solicitor to record the markings on every crate and the names of every witness present. Sir Thomas placed 2 engineers on the public road to watch the site without crossing onto ducal land. As they returned to the Harrington wagons, Reed handed Margaret a torn sheet he had concealed inside his coat. He had taken it from Crane before being caught. It was not another eviction list. It was a delivery account for lamp oil, dry straw, hunting screens, and mining powder, all ordered for the same 3 southern fields through which Julian's Christmas hunt would pass. Margaret looked back at the emptying reservoir. Wycliffe did not need to destroy the entire wall. He needed only one disaster severe enough to declare the villages unsafe. Julian had supplied the dry cisterns, the political witnesses, and the authority to clear the land. Wycliffe would supply the flame. Reed examined the calculation beneath the light of the carriage lamp. "This is too much powder for ordinary excavation," he said. "Enough to bring down half the southern wall. And send the remaining water where?" He traced the contours with one finger. "Through Millbank and into the lower farms. The same farms named first in the eviction papers." Margaret studied the map. Wycliffe did not merely intend to empty the villages. He intended to make them uninhabitable, then blame the catastrophe upon the neglected reservoir and the woman who had managed it. But the plan contained a contradiction. If they mean to destroy the wall, why order Julian to drain the basin first? To conceal the powder while the bed is exposed? Perhaps. But an empty reservoir cannot flood the villages. Reed looked toward Ravensmere Hall. Unless they planned to refill it. Margaret understood immediately. Once her engineers were dismissed, Wycliffe could close the lower gates and divert the river into the basin. The water would rise without being measured. A controlled explosion would then appear to be structural failure, caused by years of supposed embezzlement. Julian's accusation had supplied the culprit before the crime occurred. "We need proof that Wycliffe placed the powder," Reed said. "And we need the receipts that prove the reservoir was properly maintained." Margaret folded the geological map and returned it to him. "Tomorrow, inspect the southern wall with 2 men you trust, quietly. Do not remove anything. If Wycliffe's men realize we know where the charges are, they will move them. And you? I shall attend my own public execution." Saturday arrived beneath a pale winter sun. 200 tenants gathered beside the reservoir. Men removed their caps as Margaret approached. Women held children close against the cold. Many had known her since she first surveyed the marsh as a young bride, with mud on her boots and measuring chains over her shoulder. Now a wooden platform stood above the main gate. Julian waited upon it with Lady Cecily and Lord Wycliffe. Behind them, laborers carried hammers and iron bars. The silver key hung from Margaret's waist. Julian began by speaking of progress, political opportunity, and land wasted upon unnecessary water. Then his tone became solemn. "Unfortunately, an examination has revealed grave irregularities in the reservoir accounts." Whispers moved through the crowd. "For 11 years, Julian continued, Her Grace exercised unchecked authority over these works. Thousands of pounds cannot presently be accounted for." Margaret watched the tenants' faces. Confusion, fear, in some, disbelief. Julian could have stopped. Instead, he looked directly at her and delivered the lie she had warned him would destroy her name. "Until a full inquiry is completed, Duchess Margaret is relieved of all authority at Ravensmere." Lord Wycliffe stepped forward to receive the key. Margaret climbed onto the platform. "May I ask one question before surrendering it?" Julian's expression hardened. "1. Who examined the accounts?" "Mr. Silas Crane, Wycliffe's private clerk." "And where are the missing receipts?" "They cannot be located." "Who controlled the room from which they vanished?" Julian glanced toward Wycliffe but did not answer. Margaret faced the tenants. "The Duke has chosen not to tell you, so I shall. The receipts disappeared after Lord Wycliffe's clerk took custody of the estate books." Wycliffe laughed. A desperate accusation from a woman caught stealing. Several tenants shouted angrily. Others demanded to see the accounts. Julian raised his hand. "Enough. Give him the key." Margaret removed it. For one heartbeat, she remembered Julian standing beside her when the gates first opened 11 years ago. He had called the reservoir their greatest shared achievement. Now he was trading it for applause from men who would abandon him the moment he ceased to be useful. She placed the silver key upon the boards, not in Wycliffe's hand, at Julian's feet. "You signed the demolition order," she said. "You chose the men who accused me. You refused an independent audit. Whatever happens after today belongs to you." Julian's boot came down upon the key. The delicate silver shaft bent beneath his heel. A gasp passed through the crowd. "Break the gates," he ordered. The first hammer struck iron. Margaret did not turn away. The second blow severed a locking pin. At the third, the lower valve jolted open and water thundered into the spillway. Children cried out as the basin began to drain. Then another sound rose from the northern road, the heavy clatter of wagons. 12 blue vehicles bearing the Harrington crest descended toward the mills. Engineers walked beside them, carrying removal orders signed by Margaret's father. Wycliffe seized Julian's arm. "Stop them!" Julian looked at Margaret. "What have you done?" "Exactly what I notified you I would do." By sunset, the first pumping engine had been disconnected from Ravensmere's coal mine. The grain mills stopped next. At the castle stables, Harrington workers removed the pressure valves that supplied the upper troughs. Julian dispatched constables to halt them, but Sir Thomas Harrington had anticipated the attempt. Each crew carried certified copies of the ownership agreements and was accompanied by a solicitor. No lawful order could prevent the removals. Margaret stood beside her father's carriage as the final mill wheel slowed into silence. Sir Thomas stepped down without waiting for a servant. At 64, he retained the imposing build of the engineer who had once supervised bridges in 3 counties. He embraced his daughter briefly, then looked toward Julian on the distant hill. "I received your documents," he said. "Tell me only this. Did he know the accusation was false?" "He knew he had no proof." "That is enough." Margaret handed him the eviction papers and geological map. His anger disappeared behind a colder expression as he read. "Wycliffe tried this in Northumberland," he said. Her attention sharpened. "Tried what?" "Acquiring damaged land through intermediaries after mining accidents. 12 families were driven away. 2 men died underground. Was he charged?" The witnesses withdrew their statements. "Why?" "One vanished. The other received enough money to leave England." A rider galloped toward them from the reservoir. It was one of Reed's assistants, his coat torn and blood streaking one side of his face. He nearly fell while dismounting. "Your Grace, the southern wall," he gasped. "We found the powder. Where is Mr. Reed?" The young man looked back toward the darkening valley. "Wycliffe's men took him. They said if you produce the eviction papers, they will seal him inside the wall before they blast it." Margaret folded the eviction papers before Reed could touch them. "If Wycliffe hid these here, why abandon them?" "He may not have abandoned them," Reed said. Someone broke the lock. A faint scrape sounded above them. Reed extinguished the lamp. Margaret remained motionless as footsteps crossed the gatehouse floor. A man paused beside the open trapdoor, then hurried outside. Reed climbed first. By the time Margaret followed, the gatehouse was empty. Through the window, she saw a rider disappearing into the woods on a gray horse. "He knows we found the box," she said. "We should take it directly to a magistrate." "Wycliffe controls the nearest magistrate, and these are drafts, not signed orders. He will claim they were invented by me." Margaret divided the papers into 2 bundles. Reed concealed one beneath his coat. She placed the other inside the lining of her traveling case. "We need to know what the Crown Surveyor intends to inspect." Reed nodded toward the water. "And why Wycliffe needs the valley emptied before he arrives." That evening, Margaret returned to Ravensmere Hall and found her apartments being searched. 2 footmen stood beside overturned drawers, while Julian's new secretary examined her correspondence. Lady Cecily watched from the fireplace. Margaret removed her gloves slowly. "Leave." The footman looked toward the secretary. Margaret's voice hardened. "You have served this house longer than he has. Decide whose order will shame you tomorrow." Both men withdrew. The secretary remained until Lady Cecily dismissed him with a slight nod. "Julian authorized the search," Cecily said. "Several estate receipts are missing. They disappeared from a room controlled by your father's clerk. You cannot prove that. Neither can Julian prove I stole them. That is why you are searching for something more useful." Cecily approached her. "Give up the reservoir, Margaret. Your reputation may survive negligence. It will not survive criminal charges." Margaret studied her face. Cecily appeared calm, but her right hand was clenched around a small brass key, the key to Margaret's writing desk. "You came here expecting to find the engineering contracts." For the first time, Cecily's composure cracked. Margaret stepped closer. "Your father believes the estate cannot function without my family's equipment. He wants to know whether we can withdraw it. You overestimate your importance. No. Julian underestimated it for both of you. Cecily left without another word. Margaret locked the door, but she did not sleep. Before dawn, a messenger arrived from her father. Sir Thomas Harrington had received the contracts and would act the moment Margaret gave the order. He had also enclosed a copy of Ravensmere's original reservoir agreement. One clause had been marked in red. The iron gates, pumps, and distribution mechanisms remained the property of Harrington Engineering until the final construction debt was repaid. Julian had never paid it. Margaret could legally remove nearly the entire system. At breakfast, she found him surrounded by hunting plans. Lord Wycliffe sat at his right hand, while Cecily occupied Margaret's customary place. "I require access to the estate accounts," Margaret said. Julian did not look up. "You have been suspended from all financial duties. Then I require written confirmation that you accept sole responsibility for draining the reservoir." Wycliffe smiled. "Preparing your defense already? I am establishing who will answer when the villages lose water." Julian pushed back his chair. "The river will supply them. The river is partly frozen, and its winter flow cannot support 6 villages. Wycliffe's surveyor says otherwise. His surveyor has never measured it." Julian's face reddened. "Enough. On Saturday, you will surrender the key publicly." Margaret placed a document beside his plate. "It is noticed that my family will reclaim its equipment immediately afterward." Wycliffe's smile vanished. Julian scanned the clause, then turned upon him. "You assured me the machinery belonged to Ravensmere." "It is a technicality," Wycliffe said. "It is ownership," Margaret corrected. "By Saturday evening, every Harrington pump will be gone. The mills will close. The mine shafts will begin filling with groundwater. Your stables will depend upon barrels carried from 12 miles away." Julian rose. "You would cripple your own husband's estate? You are destroying the system that made it function. I am merely refusing to finance the destruction." For a moment, uncertainty entered his eyes. He could still postpone the demolition. He could investigate Wycliffe's plan. Instead, he tore the notice in half. "Proceed," he told Wycliffe. Margaret left the room knowing that whatever remained between them had just been sacrificed willingly. Outside, Reed waited beside a carriage. "We identified the Crown Surveyor," he said. "He is inspecting mineral rights. Beneath the reservoir? Beneath all 200 tenant holdings." He handed her a geological map stolen from Wycliffe's temporary office. A black seam ran beneath the villages and converged beneath the drained basin. Coal. Margaret traced the boundary lines. If the tenants were expelled before the survey, Wycliffe could claim the deposits through the ducal estate. Then she noticed a handwritten calculation beside the southern embankment. It estimated not the value of coal, but the quantity of blasting powder required to collapse the reservoir wall. Duke Julian ordered the gates of his wife's reservoir smashed before 200 tenants, and announced that Duchess Margaret had invented the threat of drought to steal money from his estate. While laborers drained 11 years of her work into the frozen valley, he presented the land to Lord Wycliffe, the political patron who intended to transform it into England's grandest private hunting ground. Margaret did not beg him to reconsider. She removed the silver key of the waterworks from her waist and placed it beneath his boot. By nightfall, her father's engineering company had withdrawn every pump, surveyor, and line of credit supporting Julian's estate. By morning, his mills had stopped turning, and his prized horses had no water. Then, during his lavish Christmas hunt, flames erupted across the dry tenant fields. As Julian's guests fled toward empty wells, Margaret discovered that the reservoir had not been destroyed merely for sport. Someone had buried sealed eviction orders beneath its foundations, and all 200 tenant families were to lose their homes before New Year's Day. 11 days earlier, the reservoir still lay beneath a skin of winter ice. Margaret stood in its western gatehouse with both hands resting upon a survey table. Before her lay a map of Ravensmere, the ducal estate she had entered as a bride 12 years ago, and learned to understand more intimately than the man who had inherited it. 6 villages depended upon the reservoir. So did 3 grain mills, the castle stables, the brew house, the tenant orchards, and every firefighting cistern between Ravensmere Hall and the northern boundary. Red ink marked the current water level. Black ink marked the minimum needed to carry the estate safely through winter. The 2 lines were separated by less than 4 inches. "We cannot release another gallon," Margaret said. Mr. Elias Reed, the chief engineer sent years ago by her father, removed his spectacles and wiped them with a square of linen. He was nearly 60, broad-shouldered despite his age, and incapable of disguising unpleasant facts. His Grace has ordered the southern basin emptied by Friday. Margaret did not look up. His Grace has never inspected the southern basin. He intends to ride across it on Christmas Day. He may intend to ride across the moon. That does not make it safe. Reed's mouth tightened. But there was no humor in his expression. He slid a folded order across the table. Julian's signature appeared beneath a paragraph authorizing Lord Wycliffe's men to remove the sluice chains, break the retaining lip, and drain the valley. Margaret recognized her husband's impatient hand immediately. She also recognized the date. Julian had signed the order 3 days before, asking her whether the reservoir could be emptied. The realization should not have wounded her. Over the last 2 years, she had grown accustomed to his counsels being held without her, his accounts arriving with missing pages, and his political friends speaking as though her work were an embarrassing domestic amusement. Yet 3 days ago, Julian had sat beside her at dinner and listened while she explained that the estate faced its driest winter in 17 years. He had already decided to destroy the reservoir while pretending to seek her advice. "Who delivered this?" she asked. "One of Lord Wycliffe's clerks. Not the estate steward?" "No, Your Grace." That troubled her almost as much as Julian's signature. Margaret moved to the narrow window. Below, the frozen reservoir curved between wooded hills like a sheet of dark glass. Men she had trained were testing the eastern valves. Beyond them stood 6 stone cottages built for the waterkeepers and their families. 11 years ago, the basin had been a marsh that flooded in spring and dried to cracked mud by August. Margaret had designed the first channels herself. Her father's company supplied iron gates at cost, and her marriage settlement financed the excavation when Julian's trustees refused. In the first year after completion, the reservoir saved the lower villages from drought. Julian had lifted her onto the completed wall before hundreds of cheering tenants and whispered that Ravensmere would remember her name long after both of them were gone. She wondered whether he remembered saying it. Hooves struck the frozen road outside. A black carriage passed through the gate below, its lacquered door bearing Lord Wycliffe's golden fox. Behind it came 6 wagons, loaded with painted hunting screens, wine crates, and timber for temporary pavilions. Not equipment for examining a reservoir. Preparations for taking possession of it. Margaret turned from the window. "Send copies of the water records to my father. Include every maintenance bill paid through Harrington Engineering." Reed hesitated. "Do you expect a legal dispute?" "I expect my husband to accuse me of whatever Wycliffe requires him to believe." A knock sounded before Reed could answer. Julian entered without waiting for permission. The Duke of Ravensmere was 38, tall and elegantly dressed, with the composed face that London newspapers praised as evidence of natural leadership. That morning, however, irritation sharpened every feature. Melted frost darkened the shoulders of his riding coat. Lady Cecily Vale followed him. She was the widowed daughter of Lord Wycliffe, and had spent much of the autumn at Ravensmere Hall, advising Julian on which families might support his entrance into national politics. Her red velvet habit was entirely unsuitable for an engineering station, yet not a fleck of mud marked its hem. Julian glanced at Reed. "Leave us." "My engineer stays," Margaret said. "He is employed upon my estate. He is employed by my father's company and paid from my settlement." Lady Cecily lowered her eyes, concealing a small smile. Julian saw it. Pride did what reason could no longer accomplish. "Very well," he said. "Let him witness your refusal." He placed another document upon the survey table. This one announced a public estate meeting on Saturday morning. All tenant heads of household were commanded to attend. Margaret read the first paragraph, then the second. The accusation appeared in the third: misappropriation of maintenance funds. She read it twice, not because she failed to understand the words, but because Julian had once defended her honor against a lord who merely joked about her arithmetic. Now, he had signed a declaration accusing her of theft. "You know this is false. I know the reservoir consumed nearly £4,000 in 11 years, and returned more than 3 times that amount through protected harvests and uninterrupted milling. So your ledgers claim—" "My ledgers have been inspected every quarter, by men employed by your father." Reed took a step forward, his face darkening. Margaret lifted one hand, stopping him. She kept her gaze upon Julian. "You had the estate books examined last spring. Your own auditor found no discrepancy. Several receipts are now missing. From whose custody?" Julian's silence answered her. The receipts had been stored in the ducal accounting room, to which Margaret's staff had been denied access for 6 weeks. Lady Cecily moved closer to the table. "No one is suggesting that Her Grace personally removed them." "The notice says precisely that," Margaret replied. "It says funds were misappropriated under your authority." a distinction designed for drawing rooms. The tenants will hear only that their Duchess stole from them. Julian's jaw tightened. This need not become uglier than it already is. Relinquish the keys, endorse Wycliffe's development plan, and I will amend the statement to describe the matter as negligent oversight. Margaret stared at the man she had married. There it was. Not doubt, not confusion, not even anger. A bargain. He knew the accusation could be softened because he had chosen its wording. He was offering to return part of her reputation if she surrendered the reservoir without resistance. "What has Wycliffe promised you?" she asked. "This estate requires influence. How much? Do not speak to me as though I were one of your clerks. Then do not bring me a fraudulent account and expect me to sign it." Julian struck the table with his palm. The measuring instruments jumped. Lady Cecily flinched, but Margaret did not. "Wycliffe can secure my parliamentary nomination," Julian said. "The hunting ground will attract men whose support Ravensmere has lacked for a generation. I will not sacrifice the future of this house because you have developed an unnatural attachment to gates and ditches." Margaret felt something inside her become very still. Not broken. Finished. She folded the public notice and returned it to him. "You could have questioned the missing receipts," she said. "You could have asked why Wycliffe's clerk, not your steward, delivered the demolition order. You could have inspected the water levels yourself. I have heard enough." "No, Julian. You have heard only the men who promise you power." He took the notice. "Saturday, 10 o'clock. Bring the silver key." Margaret looked toward the reservoir, where 200 families' winter supply waited behind iron gates bearing her father's foundry mark. Then she looked back at her husband. "I will bring it," she said. Julian appeared satisfied. He turned and offered Lady Cecily his arm. Only after their carriage disappeared did Reed speak. "You cannot mean to surrender." Margaret opened the locked drawer beneath the survey table and removed the contracts governing every pump, mill channel, and emergency cistern on the estate. "No," she said quietly. "But if he intends to tell Ravensmere that the water belongs entirely to him, I shall allow him to discover what else does not." She separated 3 agreements from the bundle and placed them before Reed. "Send these to my father tonight. No ducal courier. Use one of our own riders." Reed examined the documents. His eyes widened at the cancellation clauses. Then something scraped beneath the floorboards. Both of them froze. The sound came again, wood against stone, directly below the gatehouse. Reed lifted the trapdoor beside the main valve wheel. Cold air rose from the maintenance chamber, carrying the smell of damp earth and fresh sealing wax. Margaret descended first. A loose plank had been forced behind the western pipe. When Reed pulled it free, they found a narrow tin dispatch box buried in the mud. It bore no ducal crest. Its lock had already been broken. Inside lay a stack of folded documents, each sealed with Lord Wycliffe's golden fox. Margaret opened the first and read the heading. Provisional transfer of vacated holdings. Below it appeared the name of a tenant family from the lower village, then another, and another, 200 names in all. At the bottom of the final page, beside the date of New Year's Day, someone had written a single instruction: "Clear the valley before the crown surveyor arrives."